November 1923, Berlin. A mother walks into a bakery with a wheelbarrow, not to carry bread home, to carry money to buy it. The wheelbarrow is packed full of paper bills, stacks and stacks of German marks, piled so high they threaten to spill onto the street. She empties the entire wheelbarrow onto the counter. The baker counts. It's not enough. The price of bread has doubled since this morning. She leaves empty-handed, pushing her wheelbarrow of worthless paper back into the cold. This was Germany in 1923, a country where money died, where life savings evaporated overnight, where a single loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks, where children used stacks of cash as building blocks because the paper was worth more as a toy than as currency. This was not a distant medieval collapse. This was less than a century ago, in one of the most advanced economies in Europe, and it happened fast, faster than anyone thought possible. Let's go back to 1918. Germany had lost World War I. The Treaty of Versailles was signed in June 1919. The terms were brutal. Germany was required to pay reparations to the Allied powers. The total? 132 billion gold marks. In today's money, that's over $500 billion. Germany was expected to pay roughly 2.5% of its entire GDP every single year for decades. But here's the problem. Germany didn't have the money. The war had drained the economy. Industrial production had collapsed. The government was deeply in debt. Before the war, $1 was worth about 4 German marks. By 1920, that had jumped to 70 marks per dollar. The mark was already losing value, but most people didn't panic. Inflation wasn't new. Prices had doubled during the war. Everyone assumed things would stabilize. They didn't. The German government faced an impossible choice. They could raise taxes to pay the reparations, which would crush an already suffering population. Or they could print money. They chose to print. The reasoning seemed logical at the time. If we need more currency to pay our debts and stimulate the economy, we simply create it. What could go wrong? Everything. In 1921, the Reichsbank, Germany's central bank, began printing marks at an unprecedented rate. Not to stimulate growth, to pay reparations and cover government expenses. The more they printed, the less each mark was worth. By mid-1922, $1 was worth 320 marks. Prices were rising, but life was still manageable. People adjusted, salaries went up, shopkeepers raised prices. It was uncomfortable, but survivable. Then came January 1923. France and Belgium, frustrated that Germany had fallen behind on reparations payments, invaded the Ruhr Valley. This was Germany's industrial heartland, coal mines, steel mills, factories, the backbone of the German economy. The French and Belgians occupied it by force, intending to extract resources directly as payment. The German government's response was defiance. They ordered a policy of passive resistance. Workers in the Ruhr were told to stop working, do nothing that helps the occupiers. It was essentially a general strike. 2 million people in industry, administration, and transportation walked off the job. The government promised to support them. They would still receive wages, 2/3 of their normal pay. But there was a problem. The government had no money. So they printed it. Billions and billions of marks flooded into circulation to pay striking workers who weren't producing anything. At the same time, Germany's industrial production ground to a halt. Coal stopped being mined, steel stopped being made, goods became scarce. And when goods are scarce but money is abundant, prices explode. By June 1923, $1 was worth 192,000 marks. Inflation was no longer creeping. It was sprinting. Prices doubled every few days, then every day, then twice a day. Workers began demanding to be paid twice a day, because if they waited until the end of their shift, their wages would already be worthless. Restaurant prices changed while customers were eating. You'd order a coffee for 5,000 marks. By the time you finished, a second coffee cost 7,000 marks. Not because the cafe owner was greedy, because the money was collapsing in real time. Shopkeepers stopped pricing goods. They'd write a number, cross it out an hour later, write a new one. Some gave up entirely and just started bartering. Farmers refused to sell crops for marks. They wanted gold or foreign currency or goods they could actually use. Food disappeared from cities. Black markets flourished. People who worked for wages starved because their paychecks were worthless the moment they received them. By October 1923, $1 was worth 170 billion marks. Let that sink in. Billion? With a B, a single American dollar could buy 170 billion German marks. And it was still getting worse. November 1923. Peak hyperinflation. $1 was worth 4.2 trillion marks. 4.2 trillion. That's 4,200 billion. The number is almost incomprehensible. At this point, the German mark wasn't money anymore. It was confetti. People burned cash to stay warm because buying firewood cost more than the money itself was worth. Children played with bundles of million-mark notes like they were toys. Wallpaper was cheaper to buy than the marks it took to purchase it. A loaf of bread, which cost 250 marks in 1918, cost 200 billion marks in November 1923. That's not a typo. 200 billion marks. For one loaf of bread. The human cost was staggering. Pensioners were destroyed. Imagine you'd worked your entire life, saved diligently, retired with what you thought was a comfortable nest egg. Then, in the span of months, that entire lifetime of savings became worthless. You couldn't buy a single meal. Elderly Germans starved, literally starved. Suicide rates soared. The middle class was obliterated. Doctors, teachers, engineers, people who had spent decades building financial security, gone in months. A middle-class family's savings, which could have bought a house in 1922, couldn't buy a loaf of bread in 1923. These were people who had followed the rules, worked hard, saved responsibly, and they lost everything. Meanwhile, some people got rich. Debtors thrived. If you owed money, hyperinflation was a gift. You'd borrowed 10,000 marks to buy a house in 1920. By 1923, you could pay off that entire mortgage with pocket change. Literally. The debt was still 10,000 marks, but 10,000 marks was now worth nothing. Speculators made fortunes. People with access to foreign currency or hard assets became wealthy overnight. But for most Germans, it was catastrophe. Trust evaporated. Not just in the currency, in the entire system. People stopped believing in democracy. The Weimar Republic, Germany's fragile attempt at democratic government, was blamed for the disaster. Extremist political movements surged. The communists gained support. So did the far right. In Munich, a charismatic speaker named Adolf Hitler used the chaos to his advantage. On November 8th and 9th, 1923, at the peak of the hyperinflation, Hitler and his supporters attempted a coup. The beer hall Putsch, it was called. It failed. Hitler was arrested and sent to prison. While there, he wrote the first volume of Mein Kampf. The hyperinflation didn't directly put Hitler in power, but it created the conditions. It destroyed faith in the government. It made people desperate. It made them willing to listen to extremists who promised order, strength, and someone to blame. So, how did it end? In November 1923, the government finally took drastic action. A man named Hjalmar Schacht was appointed currency commissioner. He did something radical. He stopped the printing presses. On November 15, 1923, a new currency was introduced, the Rentenmark. It was backed not by gold, which Germany didn't have, but by land. Agricultural and industrial land was mortgaged to back the new currency. One Rentenmark was worth 1 trillion old marks. The psychological effect was immediate. People believed in the Rentenmark because it was tied to something real, something that couldn't be printed into oblivion. The government also slashed spending, cut public sector jobs by 25%, raised taxes. These measures were painful, but Germans, exhausted and traumatized by months of hyperinflation, accepted them. Anything was better than the chaos. The hyperinflation ended almost as quickly as it had begun. By early 1924, prices had stabilized. The Rentenmark held its value. Germany began to recover economically. But the psychological scars remained. An entire generation had watched their savings, their security, their futures dissolve into worthlessness. That trauma never left. What caused the hyperinflation? It wasn't just one thing. It was a cascade of failures. The war debts, the reparations burden, the decision to print money instead of raising taxes. The Ruhr occupation, the government paying striking workers with printed currency while production collapsed. Each decision seemed reasonable in isolation. Together they created a perfect storm. But here's the deeper lesson. Hyperinflation doesn't happen because of economics alone. It happens because of psychology. Money only has value because people believe it has value. The moment that belief breaks, the currency collapses. And once trust is lost, it's almost impossible to restore. Could it happen again? Look around. Central banks today print money on a scale that would have been unimaginable in 1923. It's called quantitative easing. Governments run deficits that dwarf anything the Weimar Republic ever attempted. The response to every crisis is the same. Print more, spend more, worry about the consequences later. The difference, we're told, is that modern central banks are smarter. They have better tools, better models. They can control inflation. They can print money without destroying the currency. Can they? Germany thought the same thing in 1922, right up until they couldn't. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. The Weimar hyperinflation was a warning. When governments print money to solve problems they can't otherwise fix, when debt spirals out of control, when trust in the currency begins to crack, the collapse can come faster than anyone imagines. In Germany, it took less than 2 years to go from manageable inflation to total economic meltdown. 2 years. That's all it took to destroy one of Europe's strongest economies. The wheelbarrow full of money, the bread that cost billions, the children playing with worthless cash. These aren't just historical curiosities, they're warnings. And the next time someone tells you that printing money is the solution to economic problems, remember Germany. Remember 1923. Remember the day money died.